Morning, family. Good to see everyone this morning. 1 Peter 2, verse 9, please. It says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession." Why? Why were we chosen? So that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who's called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. It's one of our most deeply held beliefs in this church that we are called to manifest the glory of Jesus Christ in our lives and to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us. And as I started the day today, I thought I wanted to talk about two things that keep us from manifesting the life of Christ. But I think actually I'm just going to focus on one because I think it's the most important thing. I think the thing that keeps us from manifesting the life of Christ the very most is a wrong attitude towards taking up the cross, a wrong attitude towards sin, and a wrong attitude towards specifically the very next giant in the promised land, so to speak. If you'll turn to 2 Corinthians 4, there's a verse here. Paul says clearly, how do we manifest the life of Jesus Christ? If Peter says we are called for this purpose, that we might proclaim the excellencies of him who called us, how do we proclaim the excellencies of him who called us? So just by word? How do we do it? And in 2 Corinthians in chapter 4, the Apostle Paul tells us clearly how we manifest the life of Jesus in our body. Look at verse 10 with me. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 10. He says, we're always carrying about in our body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus might be manifested in our body. So what he's saying here is that the life of Jesus is only manifested in our lives insofar as we're carrying about in our bodies the dying of Jesus. And because of that, Paul says, I always carry Jesus dying in my body because I always want to be manifesting his life. And it's easy if we just read that casually, we can think, oh, what that means is I remember. I'm always remembering that Jesus died, right? But that's not what Paul means. When Paul says I'm always carrying about in my body the dying of Jesus, he doesn't mean that I have a reminder that says, hey, remember Jesus died for you. We know what he means is I am taking up my cross. Jesus said, no one can be my disciple unless they take up their cross just like me and follow me every single day. And just luckily, the Apostle Paul himself in this very verse in 2 Corinthians 4, he defines what it means to carry about in our body the dying of Jesus. That's what he says in verse 10. If you look at verse 11, he says, just to be clear, it's as if he's saying, just so you know what I mean when I say we're carrying about in our bodies the dying of Jesus, this is what I mean. We who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus might be manifested in our bodies. So he himself defines that phrase here. The phrase he uses in verse 10, he defines in verse 11. Carrying about in our bodies the dying of Jesus means we are constantly being delivered over to death. And I believe from the depths of my heart that the reason the life of Jesus Christ is not manifested is we have a lax attitude to bearing about in our bodies the dying of Jesus Christ. Being delivered over to death is what manifests the life of Jesus in our lives. And the word that I was really drawn to as I was thinking about this week is this word always in verse 10. Always carrying about in our body. And in verse 11, constantly. He's saying we're always being delivered over to death. We're constantly bearing about in our bodies the dying of Jesus. And the life of Jesus is only manifested as we're putting to death the deeds of our bodies. And if we choose at any point to stop being delivered over to death, we cease to manifest the life of Christ. And it's tempting to think, oh, if I become a Christian, necessarily I'm just going to manifest the life of Jesus Christ. But what Paul says is, no, I want to manifest the life of Jesus. And the only way that I know, this is what the Apostle Paul says here, the only way I know how to do it is to constantly bear in my body the dying of Jesus. What does that mean? It means a new day before me. If I want to manifest the life of Christ today, as if I've never borne my cross before. I have to willingly choose to take up the cross and follow him. And today, no matter what my track record is in the past, no matter how long I've known the Lord, no matter what he's done in my life, if I do not willfully take up the cross, I will not manifest the life of Jesus Christ. And to me, it's so important to remember that unless I choose willfully today to take up the cross, it's impossible for me to manifest the life of Jesus Christ. I think one of the most important messages we received as a church in 2017 is when we heard the message from Sandeep, Every Last Giant. I don't know if you remember this message, but he talked, I think from Romans 6:14, it says, sin shall not be master over you. And what Sandeep was sharing is no sin should ever be master over us. And he talked about that, do we have the expectation that every last giant will die in our lives? And I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. We've been, just by background, for those who weren't here for that message, we've been tremendously encouraged in our church to see the picture of the Israelites. They were taken out of captivity in Egypt, and God led them into the promised land. And we've seen that as a picture in our church for a life that we can now live in Jesus Christ, that we're delivered from slavery to sin. It says before we know God, we have no choice but to sin. We're enslaved to it. But he delivers us from the slavery of sin, and he wants to bring us into the promised land of rest, of peace with God, and rest with him at all times. And the way that God led his people in the Old Testament was he led them nation by nation. They had to kill them. They had to possess the land. And he led them nation by nation. And as they continued to kill the giants and the inhabitants of the promised land, they increasingly possessed what God had for them. And we've seen that as a picture for our lives in our church, that increasingly, as we want to enter into the fullness of what God has for us, we have to have that same attitude and let no giant or lust of our flesh, any desire which is unlawful or which is contrary to the law and desire of God, we cannot let it live in the land. And any desire we allow to live in the land, which is contrary to God's will, we will not be able to enjoy the fullness of what he has promised us. And what I saw as I was looking at the lives of Israel this last week is as long as they continued marching forward, God's glory went before them. And he had a good name and testimony, and his fame expanded. But I was thinking about this phrase that Sandeep used last year, every last giant. And I was asking myself the question, how can I know what my attitude to every last giant is? I mean, most of these giants I don't even know who they are or what they are. What lust may be reigning or may have sway in my life, I'm not even aware. So how can I know what my attitude to every last giant is? Because I can hold a belief or a doctrine or a theology that every last giant should fall. That may be part of my doctrinal statement, but that's very different from laying hold of the reality that every last giant is dying. So how can I know if I have the attitude? And what I found, what I would submit to you all as my brothers and sisters, is that we can only discover what our attitude to every last giant in our promised land is by looking at our attitude to the very next giant in our promised land. And our attitude towards the very next giant in our promised land is a good indication of our attitude towards every last giant. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say your very next giant? You use that phrase. If I were sitting and someone was saying that, I would know. I'd go, oh, and there's some sin, some attitude, something which holds sway that I go, this is the next giant. This is the giant before me. The Lord had his people encounter one inhabitant at a time. And at least for me, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm pretty well aware of what is that giant that's holding sway. And what I would say is for many of us, the very next giant may be a giant which has plagued us for a while. We may have almost come to accept an uneasy peace with this giant. We come to sense that, this giant has been haunting us and our lives are ruling us for so long that we just say, I just hope the giant stays in hiding. I don't actually think he's going to die, but if he just keep from rearing his ugly head, I'd be happy, right? And we can almost have a little bit of an uneasy peace as long as the giant doesn't torment us too much. And the Lord's been asking me the question, the giant that you're aware of, that's where I want you to change your attitude. And the reason you aren't manifesting the life of Jesus Christ at all times is because you stopped having the attitude of bearing about in your body the dying of Jesus and taking up this cross and deciding this giant must die. An uneasy peace is unacceptable. I must see this giant die. 2018, this giant's not going to see the end of this year. And the Lord's been speaking to me clearly. You have to have that radical attitude. And if you don't have that radical attitude, you will not be able to manifest the life of Jesus Christ. Because I only can manifest the life of Jesus Christ as I'm constantly bearing about and my body is dying. And for sure, he wants me to slay the giant that I know. And if I can't slay the giant that I know, I'm never going to have an attitude of victory, a conqueror's testimony over all the giants that I don't know. And I had been asking myself the question, what's my giant's attitude towards me? One question is, what's my attitude towards that giant? But then the other way to think about it is, what's the giant's attitude towards me? And I saw an amazing picture. If you turn to Joshua, the 2nd chapter of Joshua, the people of Israel have crossed the Red Sea in Exodus. They've wandered around the desert, Deuteronomy and Numbers, and then finally the generation that was unfaithful dies. And the Lord leads Joshua he leads his people by the hand of Joshua across the Red Sea, or across the River Jordan, sorry. He led them across the Red Sea, leads them across the River Jordan, and they start defeating the giants. They start defeating the nations. And there's this amazing picture, and what I want you to do, think about your giant, whatever your giant is. The giant that I would say, if you do not defeat it, you have no hope of manifesting the life of Jesus Christ in 2018. This giant, which has been plaguing you, which you're aware of, will you have a radical attitude to this giant? And can you imagine with me for a second that this giant might have this attitude towards you? Look at Joshua chapter 2, verse 8. This is what Rahab, speaking on behalf of the people in Jericho, it's the next nation. It's the nation that knows they're under the gun. God's people have come up to this point and they're about to be encountered. And this is Rahab's testimony of what this giant thought of God's people. Verse 8, Joshua 2, verse 8. I know the Lord has given you the land. The terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land are melting away before you. We've heard of how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites. Can your giant say that? I've heard what you did to the last lust that was reigning in your flesh. I'm melting away before you. That's amazing, right? Verse 11, when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. That testimony of the giant, I believe, must be the testimony of my giants as they consider not me, I'm no one, but the God who has promised to deliver me victory over every giant. And I feel this is a wonderful picture the Lord gave me to say, this should be the attitude that giant that's been reigning has as this giant sees how God's been delivering you. That this giant says, look at verse 11. The Lord your God is God of heaven and in earth below. Our hearts melted. Let me ask a question of you that I've been asking myself. Is this the testimony of your giant? Whatever giant's in your promised land, does your giant have this testimony as this giant has seen God's work in your life? Is this giant's heart melting within them because they've heard of the power of God in your land and the confidence with which you're marching forward in his power? Or is the giant at ease? You know, if you look forward just one chapter, basically the next generation, Joshua led the people faithfully. And then if you just look at the next generation, if you go to Judges, the next book over to the right, Judges chapter 2, it shows the condition of the people just a generation later. Rahab, representing the giants in Jericho, said, our hearts are melting before us. And then you go forward just to the next book in Judges. If you look at Judges chapter 2, verse 11, it says, the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served their Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of Egypt. Verse 14, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of their plunderers, who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. as the Lord had spoken and as the Lord had sworn to them. So they were severely distressed. This is just a generation later. The giants were melting with fear before them 1 generation ago. And yet they turn the next corner in the promised land, and the Lord, his own hand is against them. Why? If you look at, we don't have to spend a lot of time there, but if you look in chapter 1 and verse 27 through verse 36 or so, it shows all of the inhabitants that the people of Israel decided to make peace with, and that they stopped trying to drive out, and that they came to some sense of understanding with the inhabitants. That's why such a big change took place in the life of Israel. And what the Lord's been speaking to me is, don't make peace with your giants. An unsteady peace is offensive to the Lord. The life of Jesus Christ will never be manifested in me. The light and the life of Jesus will only shine forth as I maintain it, this conqueror's attitude towards every single lust, every sin, every encumbrance. Hebrews 12 says, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles. Lay aside? It's almost as if it's just toss it aside. Think about the sin which so easily entangles. We can picture, this, it's such a hard fight. And what the apostle says is just lay it aside. My dad one time asked a fighter pilot friend who now flies for a commercial airline, he said, hey, what happens whenever, you're in a big storm? And the pilot said, we're reading the newspaper. And my dad said, I like to picture you up there like, pulling on the, and he goes, no, we're just reading the newspaper. But when I read Hebrews 12, when he says, let us lay aside, I picture, that seems a lot easier than this. I picture the battle's got to be gritting my teeth and bearing it. But this picture of rest and peace in the middle of the storm, that's what the Lord wants. He wants us to lay it aside. How? As we fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, he had a joy set before him that enabled him to endure his cross. He was always had his eyes fixed on his Father's pleasure. And he could say, the joy of the Lord is my strength. The strength that I derive to fight this giant comes from seeing my Father's pleasure with me. And I'm not striving as with this enemy. I'm striving in light of my Father's love. And we have to live in his love at all times so that we can maintain this conqueror's attitude, so that the life of Jesus Christ might be manifested as we're putting to death the deeds of our body. God longs to put the life of Jesus Christ on display in us. Paul says, so that the life of Jesus might be manifested in our mortal bodies. He's longing to put the life of Jesus on display in each one of our lives. We might, as we read at the beginning, proclaim the excellencies of him who's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. But the question that I've been asking myself is, will I determine in my heart that the next giant, the very next giant, not forget, but put aside for a second my attitude towards every last giant, and say the very next giant, will I determine in my heart on this giant's tombstone, the date of death is 2018. By God's grace, by the power of the Holy Spirit in me, this giant is like a dead man walking. That's the phrase they use on death row. Whenever an inmate, their days are numbered. Dead man walking. They announce it whenever somebody's walking down the hall. Dead man walking. What does that mean? This person is destined for death. Is that the attitude that I have towards my giant? This is a dead man walking. And is the honest testimony of my giant, my heart's melting within me as I see the power of the Lord, the power that God is displaying in your life as you trust in him. That's what I want. As I said at the beginning, I had there's another thing which I think inhibits life of Christ, but I'll stop there because I really want, as I look forward to 2018, I really want to have this attitude. The very next giant must die. It's not okay for this giant to continue to reign, to continue to live any longer. I don't want this giant's life hindering the manifestation of the life of Jesus Christ in me. May God help me.